The moon hung low that night, casting an eerie, silvery glow over the abandoned tracks that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dense, dark woods. The trees, twisted and gnarled, whispered secrets to one another as if they too were haunted by the history of the place. James had heard the stories, everyone had, but that was just it. Stories. Urban legends shared in hushed tones by the locals who spoke of a haunted stretch of railway that nobody dared go near after dusk. Of trains that hadn't run in decades but still made their presence known in the dead of night, carrying with them something more terrifying than the echoes of the past. Silent Screams, a channel known for sharing real horror stories, was always looking for the next big thrill, the next urban legend to unearth. And tonight, James and his friends were determined to find it. The air was thick with anticipation, and despite the chilling cold that crept into their bones, they couldn't shake the excitement, the thrill of what they might find. "Come on, it's just a track," James said, his voice wavering just slightly, betraying the nervousness he tried so hard to hide. "We'll just walk it, maybe even take a few pictures. Nothing's gonna happen." But deep down, he knew. There was something off about this place, something unnatural. It wasn't just the creepy stories, they felt real, almost tangible. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the group approached the rusted old sign that marked the entrance to the forgotten railway. The tracks, faded with time, snaked through the woods like a forgotten memory, their wooden ties crooked and rotting. In the distance, the remnants of an old, dilapidated train station lay hidden in the brush. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. "All right, everyone, let's stick together," James instructed, trying to muster up more confidence than he felt. "We'll go as far as the old station, take a few pictures, and get out." Simple, right? His friends nodded, their faces a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. They walked slowly, their footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass that had claimed the land in the absence of human presence. The air felt heavy, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The first odd thing happened just as they crossed the tracks, just beyond the first curve, where the trees seemed to close in around them. The temperature dropped suddenly, the kind of bone-chilling cold that felt like it came from deep underground. James could see his breath in front of him, a pale puff that seemed to linger longer than it should. "Did you guys feel that?" Mark, one of James's closest friends, asked, his voice shaky. "It's freezing." "I told you," Sarah whispered, "this place is bad news." But James shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just the wind, just a fluke of the weather. They kept walking, further and further down the track, until the station came into view, a decaying, crumbling structure, overrun by vines and moss, its windows shattered and dark. "Wow," Sarah breathed, snapping a picture with her phone. "This is way creepier than I imagined." They all gathered in front of the station, standing in silence as the wind howled through the trees. The sound of rustling leaves filled the air, but then, there was something else. At first, it was barely noticeable, a low, distant hum, like the sound of an engine. James froze, his heart skipping a beat. His mind raced, but it didn't make sense. No trains had run through here in years. Yet, that sound was unmistakable, the low, grating sound of a train's horn echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. "I thought I heard something," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked around nervously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "That's impossible," James said, trying to sound confident, though his own voice trembled. "There's no way. The tracks haven't been used in decades." But the sound grew louder, and then there was a strange, unsettling rumble beneath their feet. The ground vibrated, just faintly at first, but enough to make them pause, to make them question everything they thought they knew. "What the hell?" Sarah asked, eyes wide. Before anyone could respond, the air grew thick, oppressive, as though something unseen was drawing closer. The hum of the train, distant at first, now sounded as though it were right behind them, and the rumble beneath their feet grew stronger. James spun around, looking down the tracks, but all he saw was a fog, heavy, swirling, unnatural. "Run!" someone screamed, though James couldn't tell who. The sense of dread was overwhelming, smothering him. He turned to run, but then, from the depths of the fog, there was a figure, a shadow, standing motionless on the tracks. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its features were obscured by the fog, but James could feel its eyes boring into him. Those eyes, they were empty. Hollow. And as they locked onto his, he felt something cold, something ancient, creeping inside him. "Get off the tracks!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The train, impossibly real now, loomed in front of them. It was old, rusted, like the tracks themselves, but it was coming, speeding toward them, and no matter how hard they tried to run, they couldn't move fast enough. The sound of the train's horn was deafening, a shrieking, bone-rattling sound that filled the air, the trees, and the very ground beneath them. James turned back, eyes wide in terror, but the figure on the tracks didn't move. It just stood there, waiting, as if the train were meant for it, as if it were part of the train. The fog grew thicker, the train closer, the figure's dark, empty eyes now impossibly wide. And then, without warning, the ground shook. A horrific screech echoed in the night, a sound that wasn't quite human, but something else. Something that didn't belong to this world. The train, still speeding toward them, was now nothing but a blur of rust and shadow. But before it could crash into them, everything went silent. The train, the fog, the figure, they all disappeared. Like ghosts in the night. But that wasn't the end. In the silence that followed, they could hear the faintest of whispers, soft at first, like wind through leaves, but growing louder, clearer, until it felt like 1,000 voices were speaking all at once, their words incomprehensible, but full of pain. James's heart raced as he looked around, but the woods were empty. The tracks were empty. The figure was gone. Yet, the whispers, those silent screams, seemed to come from every direction. He could feel them inside his head, in his chest, in his very soul. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, voice trembling. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could hear it too. The whispers, and the feeling that something ancient and angry, was watching them. They needed to leave. But somehow, none of them could move. The whispers became louder, then softer, then louder again, echoing around them. But there was something else, too, something far worse. The faint sound of the train, coming from far away, growing closer and closer. The tracks weren't empty anymore. The fog was thickening again. And this time, it wasn't going to disappear. They turned, ready to flee, but as James glanced over his shoulder, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was there again, standing on the tracks, eyes wide, staring at them. The train was coming. And this time, it wasn't a ghost. It was something worse. Something that had never truly left. The real horror had just begun. The air was thick with terror. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was far worse, a void that pressed in on all sides. The figure on the tracks remained motionless, like a twisted statue, its hollow eyes burning into them. James felt his heart hammering in his chest, too loud, too frantic, drowning out everything else. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Mark was the first to react. He pulled at James's arm, yanking him backward. "We need to get out of here," Mark hissed through clenched teeth. His voice was shaky, the panic evident. His eyes darted around, scanning the fog for something, anything that might offer an escape. But the train was coming. James could hear it now, even over the roaring in his ears. The screeching, grating sound of metal against metal, the mournful, bone-shaking horn, and the thunderous rumble beneath their feet. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, a weight pressing down on the very air around them. The fog thickened, curling and swirling, alive with malevolent intent. The trees seemed to warp and twist in its grasp, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at the mist. He looked back at the tracks. The figure had not moved, but now it was as if the tracks themselves were breathing, exhaling a deathly fog that rolled toward them in slow, deliberate waves. The train, if it could even be called that, loomed closer, its shape warping, its edges blurry and indistinct. It didn't belong in the world they knew. It was something older, something far more terrifying. Then, there was a flash of light, a brilliant, sickly yellow light that burned the fog away for just a moment, revealing the twisted, decaying shape of the train. The train had no face. Its windows were hollowed out, dark and vacant, like the eyes of the figure on the tracks. And yet, it was real, too real. It was coming for them, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Run!" James shouted, his voice cracking, raw with fear. But as he turned to flee, something stopped him, something impossible. A hand, cold as death, gripped his shoulder. He twisted around, heart leaping into his throat, but no one was there. Nothing but the swirling fog and the still figure in the distance. Then it happened. The ground beneath them shifted. The tracks, the very earth, seemed to buckle and groan with a sound that felt like the very world was splitting apart. And suddenly, it wasn't just the fog or the train. There was a voice, low and guttural, like a growl from the earth itself, a voice that seemed to emanate from the tracks, from the very place they stood. "You should never have come." The words were an icy whisper in their minds, reverberating in their skulls, a presence that surrounded them, pressing down on them. It was not just a voice, it was a feeling, an ancient presence, one that had been buried long ago beneath the rusted rails and rotting wood. "We're not alone," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted around, her breath shallow, as though she could feel the weight of the unseen thing pressing on her chest. "No kidding," Mark muttered, his voice barely a whisper. James felt it too. The suffocating weight of something watching them. No, not just watching, waiting. Waiting for something, or someone, to slip up. He could almost feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath him, a slow, steady rhythm that matched the pounding of his own pulse. Then, as though the fog itself had come alive, a shadow stretched across the tracks. It was thin at first, like a wisp of smoke, but then it grew, darker, denser, solidifying into something almost human, but wrong, terribly wrong. It slithered along the ground, its form shifting, melting and reforming, like liquid dark. It seemed to stretch endlessly, taller than any person should be, and its edges twisted in unnatural, contorted ways, like something that could never be made in this world. James tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, his voice strangled by the sheer terror that gripped him. His legs were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by something beyond fear. The thing, whatever it was, continued to grow, moving closer, its long limbs dragging along the tracks, making no sound except for the soft, rasping breath that came from it, like the hiss of air escaping a wound. And then, the train was upon them. The deafening screech of its brakes filled the air, a sound so loud it made James's teeth rattle in his skull. The entire world seemed to vibrate with the force of it. The fog disappeared in a flash of blinding light, and for just a moment, everything was still. Everything was silent. But not for long. The train didn't stop. It couldn't stop. Its wheels screamed against the rails, grinding and screeching, sparks flying from the ancient metal as if the very machine itself was alive, caught in a desperate struggle for freedom. The figure on the tracks was still standing there, motionless, an insurmountable force that couldn't be avoided. The train slammed into it with terrifying force. James closed his eyes, the sound of metal tearing through flesh and bone echoing in his mind. The screech of the train, the horrific crunch, the sickening sound of something unnatural, something wrong being destroyed, it all bled together into a nightmarish cacophony that tore through the very air around them. And then, nothing. The train vanished, the figure disappeared. The fog returned, thicker than before, and the silence came crashing back in like a tidal wave. James opened his eyes. His chest heaved with panic, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked around, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. Just the cold, empty night, the twisted trees, and the rusted tracks. The figure was gone. The train was gone. The air was still again, but it felt wrong, so wrong. It's gone, Mark whispered, his voice hollow, the words coming out like a prayer. James nodded, but his mind couldn't process it. The fear that gripped him refused to let go. The whispering had stopped, but the tension, the presence, was still there. Hanging in the air like a promise, like an omen of something darker to come. That was not real, Sarah said, almost pleading, her voice quivering with disbelief. James turned to her, his eyes wide, his heart racing. You think this is not real? Do you think that thing wasn't real? It was real. His voice shook as the words left his lips, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Something had happened here, something far beyond their understanding. And even though they were standing in the exact same spot, the same desolate stretch of railroad, everything felt different. The air felt thick, as though the very earth beneath them was holding its breath, waiting. The silence was deafening. Then, the ground beneath them shifted again. A rumble, a tremor, soft at first. A pulse, as if the earth was beating in time with their hearts. And then, from deep in the woods, they heard it, the horn. The train's horn, low and mournful, but growing louder. Louder and louder still. It wasn't gone. It had never been gone. And the figure, whatever it was still there, watching them, waiting. The air grew thick again. And from the fog, they could hear the whispers returning, the silent screams rising from the depths of the tracks. His wasn't over.